Hello, everyone. I've been watching the list of attendees and it seems to have stabilized, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is John Grego, and I'd like to welcome you to the first session of Waterways Symposium, sponsored by Congaree National Park and Friends of Congaree Swamp. The symposium accompanies Waterways, a Smithsonian traveling exhibit hosted at Congaree National Park November 13th through January 13th. And I hope many of you have had the opportunity to visit the exhibit. Superintendent Kaylin Berry and TJ Wallace from SC Humanities will talk about the exhibit and symposium in welcoming remarks tomorrow, and I'll defer to them on details of the exhibit and the symposium. I will extend thanks to the organizers of the symposium, David Shelley, Greg Cunningham, and John Manchester of Congaree National Park, and John Kupfer and Tamara Warren of the University of South Carolina. I'd also like to thank our symposium sponsors, the Central Midlands Council of Governments, Richland County Conservation Commission, and Congaree Biosphere Region. I know many of you have explored Whova, the symposium platform, and I encourage you to reach out and engage with other participants during the symposium and afterwards. The platform will remain open for 6 months, and so should serve as a source for slides, videos, and contact information. I'll be moderating the session this evening. The presenter will take questions at the end of the session. Participants can post questions to the session Q&A box located on the details page for this session. If you need technical assistance, please use the chat box on the session details page to communicate to the session host, Marie Romanelli from the Delaney Group. This session is titled A Black History of Congaree from Slavery to the Post-Civil Rights Era and will be presented by Professor Robert Greene of Claflin University. Professor Greene is an assistant professor of history at Claflin University and completed his dissertation at the University of South Carolina about the ways in which the Democratic Party leaders in the South vied for the African American vote via appeals to Southern identity and memory of the Civil Rights Movement. He has published scholarly work in Patterns of Prejudice and the collection Navigating Souths. He has also published in several popular magazines and websites, including The Nation, Jacobin, Dissent, Scalawag, and Current Affairs. His research interests include African American history, American intellectual history since 1945, and Southern history since 1945. At this time, I would like to invite Robert to unmute himself and begin the presentation.
All right, thanks so much for that kind and wonderful introduction. I'm certainly glad to be with everyone this evening to talk just a little bit about Congaree and its relationship with Black history in South Carolina. And I want to really let the audience know in advance that this is not simply a story of South Carolina or Congaree, but it's very much a story of the Black experience tied to North America, tied to the Atlantic world, really tied to the world broadly. And I hope everyone enjoys the presentation this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start our presentation this evening. Again, it is a Black history of Congaree from slavery to the post-civil rights era. And what you see on the screen right now is, of course, an image that I think quite a few of you are likely familiar with. This is the Harriet Barber House in Lower Richland, South Carolina. For those of you not from the state who are viewing this presentation, Lower Richland is just outside of Columbia, South Carolina, the capital. And really, the story of Congaree National Park, the story of Congaree Swamp, it is a story that says a great deal about Black resilience, about Black political and cultural and economic power in South Carolina, and also says a good bit about how we as historians, as thinkers, and as citizens should really think deeply about how waterways and the waters that we use, whether they be rivers or oceans or lakes, how they can influence and even inspire, in some cases, events and momentous moments in American and world history. Now, the thing about Congaree National Park in particular, one of the co-sponsors of this event, is that they have undertaken in recent years a serious good faith effort to say more about the African American experience within and outside the borders of Congaree National Park. And some of what we're going to talk about this evening is that history. Now, I do want to preface this, of course, by saying that between my presentation and wanting to get to the Q&A and having an hour or so, this is just scratching the surface of this particular history. But it is nonetheless a history that I think is particularly fascinating. Thinking about how slavery, the enslavement of Africans, really shapes quite literally Congaree Swamp and Congaree National Park. Also thinking about the political power of African Americans who lived in and around Congaree Swamp during and after the Reconstruction period. And then finally ending a bit by talking about Lower Richland and Congaree Swamp and its relationship to Jim Crow segregation and the civil rights movement and post-civil rights movement as well. Again, this is a story that very much mirrors the experience of African Americans in South Carolina and across the South. But I think, as is the case with many historical topics, it's always those interesting contours, those things that stand out that really, I would argue, set apart Congaree and the experience of Black people within it from other parts of South Carolina and indeed the American South. Now, one thing that I want us all to keep in mind, of course, is that you really can't talk about enslavement without talking about the history of the use of the environment in which those enslaved peoples lived, worked, and died. Now, certainly with the American South, it has, in many ways, a unique environmental history, much of which is shaped by, A, of course, the indigenous peoples who lived here before European contact, and then B, the enslaved Africans who were brought to places like South Carolina and elsewhere to be used to cultivate and grow cash crops as part of a larger Atlantic world economy. Now, the images you see on the screen right now, of course, show off one of the more famous crops from South Carolina, rice, and how that rice was produced. But really, when we're talking about Congaree Swamp and talking about how Congaree was shaped by slavery and then how it shaped the lives of the enslaved in it, it is again worth thinking about how this forced labor system shapes the land. Now, again, keep in mind that before European first contact with indigenous peoples in what will become South Carolina in the 17th and 18th centuries, before that, of course, you do have indigenous peoples living all throughout the area, the Yamasee tribe, the Cherokee, and many other indigenous groups as well. For many of those groups, Congaree was a place that in some ways was a buffer between those who lived in what we now call the Low Country against those who lived in what we now call the Upstate. It was also very much an area that indigenous folks and later Africans and Europeans alike traversed for the sake of trade, for commerce, and for simple travel and movement. But certainly Congaree was a foreboding place for anyone who entered it, no matter your cultural or religious or national background. Even today, of course, going to Congaree National Park, if you aren't careful, it is a place that is both majestic in its beauty and also intimidating in its size and its scope as a swamp, as a national park. Imagine, if you will, for a second, being someone who has been brought to this continent halfway around the world. And you've been brought here for one very simple reason. You have the intellect and the know-how and the cultural capacity to be used as an enslaved laborer. This is, of course, the kind of life thousands and eventually millions of Africans would be forced to endure all throughout the Americas. And certainly, what will become South Carolina, their expertise in growing a variety of crops in West Africa, their expertise in herding cattle, all of these things would become very useful as these enslaved Africans were brought to Carolina, or rather Carolina colony. Now, what's important to note, of course, is that as was the case with many other enslaved Africans in the American South, those who were brought to South Carolina were brought here because of their specific skills that were first learned in West Africa and also cultivated and improved upon in the Caribbean. Now, in South Carolina, as was the case in other Southern colonies, there were specific types of West Africans that were being sought out because of the particular technical expertise they brought to their work in the Americas. I want to make one thing very clear. The enslaved who were brought to the Americas, including, of course, South Carolina, were not brought here as simply unskilled labor. On the contrary, what they did as enslaved peoples was very much skilled labor that involved the most advanced engineering and technological know-how of the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. We see this, of course, in Congaree today with things like the cattle mounts that you see throughout the park. These are actually examples of both indigenous peoples who lived in the Congaree area, but also examples of how the enslaved used their expertise in West Africa cattle mounts and brought them over to the Americas to use here as well. Again, these cattle mounts were often put to good use in Congaree because of the fact that the area is susceptible to flooding, has been for a long time. And of course, people who invested in cattle, the planter class of South Carolina, did not want to lose their investment in cattle. But the thing about Congaree also is that even though it was a place of labor, a place where enslaved Africans left an impact in terms of engineering, it was also a place that provided potential for enslaved Africans. What you see here is actually an advertisement from a newspaper, the Carolina Gazette, in May 20th of 1802. And this advertisement that you see is about an enslaved person named Jack, who was a runaway slave. Now, if you look at the advertisement closely, you see in particular about halfway down, there's a line that says, and perhaps the most important line in this advertisement, quote, "He is well acquainted in the fork of Congaree and Wateree rivers, where he lived for some time with his former master, Mr. Edward Dudley." Now, I said that's the most important line here because consider if you're that familiar with Congaree as an area, you know how to traverse it pretty well and safely. That gives you a major advantage over peoples who might try to hunt you down and bring you back into slavery. In many ways, Congaree Swamp was a space of danger. It was a place that could be incredibly intimidating. But if you were a runaway slave, it was also a space for opportunity to run away to freedom, whether that was to go elsewhere in South Carolina or potentially to even stay within Congaree Swamp. And this brings me to something that I think is really intriguing that we don't often talk about when it comes to the experience of enslaved Africans in North America. And this is maroon communities. Now, for those who don't know, maroon communities are communities of individuals who were formerly enslaved, who ran away from slavery, and formed communities in places that were very difficult to reach and to uh, reach into. Now, if you look at the history of slavery in, say, Brazil or the Caribbean, or even places like the Great Dismal Swamp in North America, we kind of associate maroon communities more with those places. But in Congaree, we do have evidence of maroon communities that were formed in the area. Now, these maroon communities were not only symbols of resistance to slavery, they were also in many ways the first real challenges of the colonial government of South Carolina and later on the state government of South Carolina after independence from Great Britain. Now, keep in mind, many Southern governments saw as their foremost duty and responsibility to their citizens keeping the institution of slavery intact. And that included, of course, building up a state apparatus capable of bringing enslaved Africans back to their masters, capable of cutting down on slaves escaping to freedom. And of course, the very presence of maroon communities in places like Congaree Swamp presented a direct threat to not just enslavement, but also the very power of the state. Now, there is one interesting story amongst others about maroon communities that I do want to highlight. And this is, of course, about a formerly enslaved person named Joe. Now, Joe was, for lack of a better term, we might think of him as a marauder today. He was a person who was formerly enslaved, who escaped to freedom by 1820. And in 1821-22, Joe was perhaps the most hunted man in South Carolina. The reason he was able to stay away from the authorities for so long was quite simply because he knew Congaree Swamp better than anyone else in the state did. And the thing is that we know that he was a key cog in a very small but growing maroon community that existed within Congaree Swamp in the antebellum period before the American Civil War. Now, the thing is that it was, of course, difficult for Maroons to live off the land in Congaree Swamp, but to many of them, it was a better existence than continuing to live in slavery. Now, I said before that, of course, the story of Congaree is very much a microcosm of the larger story of Black history in North America, and the fate of Joe is a particular example of that. Joe being a hunted down maroon figure is partially because of the fact that by 1820, the state of South Carolina had already had to deal with potential insurrections, plots at slave insurrections, most notably the situation with Denmark Vesey in the 1810s in Charleston. By 1821-22, the entire state is on a knife's edge, worried about the fact that someone like Joe could very well foment another attempt at rebellion and resistance to slavery. Now, the thing about Maroon communities is that even after Joe's capture and death in 1823, this story of how Congaree is a place of resistance continues deep into the Civil War. Now, of course, during the American Civil War, when combat comes to South Carolina and really comes to the Midlands by 1864-65, we already have examples of captured Union soldiers using knowledge of what enslaved Africans knew about Congaree to their advantage as well. Now, I've already asked you once before to consider what it was like to have been brought across the ocean as an enslaved African. It's a fate that I don't think for any of us is truly imaginable because it's so difficult to fathom. But then think centuries later that you're fighting to save the Union and you're fighting for emancipation as a Union soldier. You're captured and sent to a camp for prisoners of war right outside Columbia, South Carolina. And let's say you're from Michigan. You have no knowledge of the state beyond what you see on a few maps here and there. You don't really know the climate very well. You don't know anyone here. But if you are a Union soldier and you try to escape as a prisoner of war from a camp outside of Columbia, you do know one thing. Those enslaved Africans who were in Columbia, all across the Midlands of South Carolina, they are without question your only friends in the area. And prisoners of war who were brought to Columbia and tried to escape noticed this and wrote about this later on after the war. There is, for example, a book by William Calkins, who was a Union prisoner of war at the end of the conflict. And in the 1890s, he wrote a memoir called The History of the 104th Regiment of Illinois Volunteer Infantry. Now, Calkins was captured in 1864. He was forced to spend part of the war at Camp Sorghum, which is again right outside Columbia. And he and a few other Union soldiers escaped from that camp in late 1864. They quickly found themselves in Congaree Swamp, wondering where exactly they could go and who they could trust. Fairly quickly, though, they received assistance from formerly enslaved Africans who themselves were also running to freedom. Later on, and I think this is really interesting, Calkins and his men came across a family living in Congaree Swamp. Decades later, William Calkins remembered quite well that the family told him they'd been living in Congaree Swamp on their own for at least 2 years. Now, this was 1864, the height of the American Civil War, right when South Carolina's government was essentially falling apart due to the Union advance from Georgia into South Carolina and the overall collapse of the Confederate government late in the war. But again, we do have stories such as this one that really show how the enslaved Africans, for many years, deep into the history of slavery in the United States, were using places like Congaree Swamp as not only routes to escape, but in some cases, just setting up shop there for years and living off the land as best they could. Now, the thing about Congaree Swamp and what I think is really interesting about thinking about the relationship between African Americans and the environment, which is really at the heart of this conversation about Congaree National Park, is that for many African Americans, the idea of land ownership was one that would animate Black political and cultural and social discourse for generations. This was certainly the case throughout the American South after the Civil War came to an end in 1865. And in many ways, it continues to be at the heart of African American political and intellectual discourse deep into the 21st century. This idea of land ownership, land for yourself, for your family, for your people. In some ways, this has its origins in the ideas of 40 acres and a mule, which were, of course, drawn from General William T. Sherman's Special Field Order in 1865, which spread like wildfire throughout the South, was supported by some in the Freedmen's Bureau and some of the radical Republicans in Congress. But ultimately, that promise of 40 acres and a mule was never really lived up to, except sort of in South Carolina. Now, a couple years ago, Columbia and the University of South Carolina were privileged to host the Urban History Association conference in 2018. And at that conference, when I told fellow historians about what we call the South Carolina Land Commission, many of them were flummoxed. They had simply never heard of it before. And I think this is because of the fact that when we think of South Carolina and American and Southern history, it tends to be the case that we think of South Carolina only in terms of the bad things about the state. The history of enslavement, the history of segregation, history of racism, so on and so forth. And this is understandable. The state does have a long, long history, much of which has influenced the rest of the United States in ways that aren't always good. And that's putting it mildly. But within South Carolina, there is also a long history of resistance to slavery, resistance to racism, and there is also a long history of visionary thinking about what the state could be and what South Carolinians could be known for if only allowed to do so. Now, this particular history really comes into play in Congaree after the American Civil War. And very briefly, I do want to talk about how in the Civil War era and afterwards, you do have some really interesting debates about land ownership, about political economic power that all come into play during the Reconstruction era. Now, for many historians, when we think of Reconstruction, we don't just think about the period after the Civil War from 1865 until 1877. For many historians, Reconstruction begins in South Carolina in 1861 with the Port Royal experiment on the coast of South Carolina, an attempt to see if newly freed African Americans would actually work and would work without having to be forced to do so as enslaved laborers. And to the surprise of many Union soldiers and New Englanders, yes, white people were willing to work if given the opportunity and a fair chance to do so. Now, by 1865-66, many federal troops and members of Congress are beginning to realize that for people to convert from enslavement to being self-sufficient citizens and laborers on their own, they were going to need some land. They were going to need a bit of help to do so. And so you do see attempts with the Freedmen's Bureau Bill of 1865, the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, attempts to get land ownership underway for newly freed Black men and women. Again, think about this. In 1865, there are 4 million men, women, and children across the American South who now find themselves no longer enslaved, thankfully, but are also unsure of what their status is as citizens and as people in the United States. And these bills are attempts to rectify that. They don't quite go far enough in the eyes of many African Americans and some radical Republicans in Congress. But in South Carolina, this issue is especially important because throughout most of the 19th century, a majority of the population in South Carolina was of African descent. Now, this brings us to the South Carolina Land Commission, which was one of the most radical ideas to come out of what many considered at the time a truly radical state constitutional convention in 1868. Now, by that time, of course, there were many in South Carolina's government who felt it was time for the state to take a radical leap forward in terms of relations between Black and white people when it came to issues of politics, economics, and so forth. And when the new state constitution of South Carolina was ratified in 1868 as an attempt to alleviate the problems plaguing many Black South Carolinians in the aftermath of the Civil War, one of the ideas to be born at that convention was the idea of a land commission. Now, this idea was very simple. The state government would purchase land from former slaveholders, planters, many of whom had lost a lot of money in the aftermath of the Civil War. In exchange for purchasing this land from former plantation owners, the idea was that it would be leased to anyone in the state of South Carolina willing to lease the land for several years to work the land and to pay off their lease. And after a period of roughly 5 years, once the lease was up, if they had paid off that lease, then they keep the land in perpetuity. Now, it's important to note that the Land Commission itself was not simply a program for Black South Carolinians. It was open to everyone in the state who wanted to purchase land. However, early on in the Land Commission's history, most white South Carolinians, refusing to honor the idea of a Republican government in South Carolina, refusing to even countenance the idea of Black people having any say in that government, boycotted the government, boycotted voting for the government, boycotted the Land Commission for many years. It wasn't really until the 1870s and early 1880s when you would see more and more white South Carolinians taking advantage of this unique program. Now, the Land Commission is particularly noteworthy because while many people remember the idea of 40 acres and a mule, and it has been used as a rallying cry for African Americans for decades in pursuit of land ownership, the South Carolina Land Commission was the only attempt in a southern state to try to apportion some land aside for African American laborers to be able to purchase, to lease, and to eventually own. And this program lasted from 1869 until roughly 1890. And throughout its history, it was often blamed for issues of criminal negligence. Sometimes folks argued there was a lot of fraud going on in the Land Commission, but that was again because of the fact that it was a Republican program in South Carolina at a time when many such programs were seen with, to say the least, skepticism throughout the American South. Now, perhaps the most important legacy of the Land Commission is that it left behind a legacy of political power in Lower Richland, South Carolina, much of which is Black political power. Now, part of the Congaree National Park itself was actually part of the Land Commission's holdings in the 1860s and 1870s. This is called the Hunt Tract, which is part of Richland County, South Carolina. This is within the confines of Congaree National Park. And during the era of the Land Commission, this was land that was bought and sold as part of that attempt to entice people to purchase land from the state government. Now, in Lower Richland, you have 180 men and women who actually try to purchase land via the Land Commission in the 1860s and 1870s. Of those, roughly 39 completed their purchases, meaning that they paid off the lease that they had and were able to keep the land after their lease time period was up. For most of them, however, if you do the math, most people weren't able to hold on to the land. This is not because of incompetence on their part, but it's more so because the Southern economy was incredibly weak in the 1870s. And it didn't help that in 1873, the US economy would collapse due to the panic of 1873. So again, what you're seeing in Congaree, what you're seeing with this land ownership idea, is how these themes of Black resilience, Black economic and political power are linked to state and national histories of not just the Reconstruction period, but also the Gilded Age, and really thinking more broadly about what it meant to have actual power in the 19th century. Much of that was in land. Now, this brings us, of course, to thinking about how Congaree continued to reflect this history of South Carolina and the American South as we proceed from Reconstruction through the late 19th century into the 20th century. Now, I mentioned a moment ago, of course, that Lower Richland was a place of Black political power in the 19th century. That did not come to an end with Reconstruction. On the contrary, by the 1890s, most of the Black leaders of the Black wing of the populist movement in South Carolina were from Lower Richland, and they were from Richland County. This, again, was a remnant of the Reconstruction era Land Commission program. Again, if you have land in the 19th century, you own your own land. If you own your own labor, then that means you also own some modicum of political power as well. And of course, this brings us again to the Barber House, which is a symbol of what that power looked like. Again, Harriet and Samuel Barber, who owned this house and owned this land for a long time, they actually represent some of what the program's best intentions were, which was to actually make sure that newly freed African Americans could get on their own 2 feet in terms of an economic and social sense, and could actually hold on to their own land for generations. And I think it's important to note that places like Congaree National Park, places like the Harriet Barber House, we should really think of them as symbols of not just political power in a Southern sense or in an African American sense, but think of them as places that show what the nation could have been if more had supported the ideals of Reconstruction in the 1860s and 1870s. Now, again, this is all a good reminder of how much land ownership and the land and the environment itself means to African Americans. This is actually a quote from a book by Nikki Finney, who is very much, or excuse me, Carolyn Finney, my apologies, who is an environmentalist, who is an environmental scholar, who has written extensively about the relationship between African Americans and the land. And this quote from her book reads, "From Wynton Marsalis, Toni Morrison, African Americans toiled, sang songs, wrote stories, and transformed the landscape with hard work, big dreams, and a belief that African Americans have and have always had an intimate, ever-changing, and significant relationship with the natural environment. This is especially true in Congaree. Even during the period of Jim Crow segregation, the 20th century, you do see Black men and women living throughout Congaree Swamp, living in Lower Richland, really trying to carve a life out for themselves, even with the constant threat of lynchings, even with the rise and fall and rise again of the Ku Klux Klan in South Carolina in the 1870s and again in the 1910s and 20s. Despite all of this, you have African Americans trying to make a way for themselves in Congaree, in Lower Richland. And again, this is symbolic of what was happening for African Americans throughout the South. Now, this is not an easy story to talk about. It's not an easy story to research or read or reflect on. But it is a story worth thinking about for just a moment. The fact that even in Congaree, a place, again, that was incredibly rural, sometimes felt that it was, if not cut off, at least separated from the rest of the state. This is a place where Black and white South Carolinians lived side by side. It was not always easy. There were reports of lynchings in Congaree and around the area in the early 20th century. But again, this place, Congaree, offered a great deal of hope for many African Americans who lived there. And this really brings us to thinking a bit more about how Congaree represents so much for African Americans in the history of South Carolina. That it is a place that by the late 20th century would become Congaree National, Congaree Monument, and then of course,
Hi there. It looks like our speaker may have disconnected. John, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's see, should I try emailing him?
My guess is he'll probably try
Here
to
he is.
join us again. Oh, great. Here we go.
Yeah, I would encourage people to start considering questions they might want to ask Dr. Greene.
Can you hear me now once again?
Yes, we can.
Oh, my apologies about that. So for whatever reason, my computer decided to stop charging. I'm not quite sure why.
Oh, no.
I do apologize about that. But the good news is that I was essentially done with my presentation. All I wanted to add at the end, I was talking about Congaree and entering the post Jim Crow period. What I do want to say to kind of sum up the presentation right here is that we really should think of places like Congaree as not only landscapes of environmental history or the history of environmental justice, but also landscapes of hope, landscapes of political and social potential, not just for African Americans, but for everyone who lived and died in Congaree Swamp. Um, Again, when we talk about the Black experience in Congaree, it is an incredibly complicated one, as we've seen this evening. But it is one that I think is worth thinking about as we really look towards the past to understand how we as South Carolinians arrived to where we are today in 2021. So that's basically my presentation nutshell. I do apologize for that, but now I'm more than happy to entertain any questions you may have.
Right. Well, I'm not seeing any questions posted just yet. If someone would like to enter a question under Q&A.
John, it looks like one just went through. And then you also have an attendee who is raising their hand. And it's up to you if you want people to actually be able to be unmuted or not.
Okay. Well, I'll start with the question I see in the Q&A. Let's see. It says, Sylviane Diouf in her book, Slavery's Exiles, draws a distinction between borderland and hinterland maroons. With known land use and environmental factors, i.e. regular floods, what evidence of established long-term communities within Congaree is there?
Oh, this is a great question. And it's funny, in the larger piece I've drawn this talk from, I do talk about her particular book when in talking about borderland versus hinterland maroons. Now, the thing is that with talking about evidence about maroon communities in Congaree, a lot of this evidence we had to draw from eyewitness accounts written by folks who were looking for enslaved Africans in Congaree. Some of this is drawn from the records of WPA writers in the 1930s who spoke to formerly enslaved peoples who lived in Congaree as maroons in the mid 19th century. Some of this is from oral histories that were passed down from generation to generation. Again, I think the distinction between borderland and hinterland maroons is really interesting because the borderland maroons, of course, they were kind of on the periphery of civilization, the periphery of farms, plantations, cities, and the like, whereas the hinterland maroons were a bit further away. They were a bit, I won't say completely cut off from civilization, but they were a bit further away than the borderland maroons were. And in the case of Congaree, I think what makes it particularly interesting as a conversation piece, talking about maroon culture, is that in some ways, Congaree as a hinterland, as a borderland, it changes depending on what era of Congaree's history you're talking about. Now, in the 18th century, of course, Congaree is very much a buffer zone between the Europeans and Africans living on the coast of South Carolina and the indigenous peoples living in the upstate. In the 19th century, that changes a bit as you have more and more Europeans moving into the upstate, moving into the Midlands and so forth, changing the landscape around them. But in terms of evidence of maroon communities, a lot of this comes from eyewitness accounts. A lot of it comes from things like the memoir I mentioned a moment ago and so forth. There is not as much physical evidence you see now in 2021 in Congaree National Park and the broader Congaree Swamp as we would like, but certainly there is enough evidence to suggest there was at least some maroon communities in the area in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Okay. And then let's see, additional questions include, let's see, why was the photo right before it cut out from the Superfund site on Bluff Road? You had the PCB protesters.
Yes, that was actually, I believe that photo was actually drawn from one of the protests in North Carolina. But I have it there because it is a reminder of how, when we think about the environmental movement, we tend to think of it more in terms of the 60s and 70s with Silent Spring, with the rise of Earth Day in 1970. But I think what makes Congaree intriguing is that it offers a lens into the environmental justice movement of the 1980s and 90s, which was a movement mostly based in the South, but not entirely in the South, but was also a movement that brought environmental justice home for many African Americans and poor whites living in the South. And again, when we think about how Congaree is linked to Black land ownership, is linked to the Black experience in South Carolina, we should also be cognizant of the fact that when African Americans think about the land and land usage, they may have ideas that are born a bit more out of the environmental justice movement, that are looking to the land not simply as something to be protected, but something to be lived in, and something to be, if not used, to certainly be utilized as a path to self-sufficiency, political power, and so forth.
Okay, thank you. And then just going by the number of votes each question's receiving, the next question I'll ask is, thank you so much for your presentation. Do you have any thoughts about additional opportunities for Congaree National Park to tell a more complete story of Black history? What can we do better? What should we focus on? How should we engage others?
Well, I think first off, I do want to commend Congaree National Park for trying to undertake endeavors like this one to help really learn more and really cultivate more of its own Black history. Because again, as I noted a moment ago, and as I've said ad nauseum this evening, it is a rich history. Now, I think in terms of continuing that, I would suggest outreach, which is already underway, outreach to families living in Lower Richland, really making sure those relationships are strengthened over time so that there is a deepening sense of trust between the people who run the national park and those who live around the national park in Lower Richland, for one. I would also suggest, and it's funny you should ask this question. I just saw right before our presentation, in fact, that the Reconstruction National Park actually posted a link online to our presentation saying, hey, you should check this out. I think collaboration between Congaree National Park and the Reconstruction National Park, if it has already taken place, and I suspect it has, but certainly making sure that collaboration continues. But really, ultimately, I think what's gonna make a big difference here is working to strengthen the relationships with Black families already living in Lower Richland, and making sure that there is a level of trust between those families on the one hand and the national park on the other that can really stand the test of time. I think once you do that, once you continue to delve into that research and delve into those relationships, it will really enhance how the park tackles Black history within and outside its borders.
Okay, and then let's see, we have had Rose Shiver has had her hand up for some time. Is it possible to unmute her, Marie?
Yes, I will do that now. Rose, I've just changed it so that you should be allowed to speak. So you'll still have to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Ed, how are you, Robert Greene? Rose Shiver.
How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing wonderful. You said something that was very, very interesting, and I've seen very, very little about, I guess, lynchings in the Columbia area and or Richland County area. And you mentioned something about lynchings in the Congaree National Park. Can you expand on that?
Sure thing. So with the lynching that I'm referring to in particular, let me get back to my notes just for one quick second.
Go for it.
The thing about lynchings, of course, as you well know, and I think as others know as well, is that we tend to talk about lynchings in the aggregate in terms of thousands of them took place across the South, but we don't really like talking about them in specific places. We don't really do a good job of talking about them in places like South Carolina the way we should. Now, the thing about Lower Richland and really about Congaree Swamp is that if you think about what the place is like, just to live in it, it is particularly foreboding. It is a place that, if you think about how it looks, I'll give you an example. There was around 1903, there were rumors that someone had been lynched in Congaree. And eventually, what they found was that the report of lynching was actually erroneous. But what is really interesting to note is that just the very threat of lynching was something that was mentioned in Congaree year after year after year. There was this threat of, if you were Black in Congaree, got out of line, there is that risk of being lynched. And this particular story, if you go back to the state newspaper on July 31st, 1903, for those of you who have access to the library archives, in the Richland library system, if you go on there, you can find stories about rumors of lynchings. There was a brief report of a lynching in the area, and what they realized was there wasn't a lynching, but there was certainly a threat of a lynching. With that said, to go from lynchings to the broader threat of anti-Black violence in Congaree, there are oral histories from older African Americans who live in the area who talk about having to run from the Ku Klux Klan in Lower Richland in the 1920s and 30s, because the Klan would come through the area, would try to intimidate African Americans, and there were times when folks feared for their lives. So between lynchings and the threat of Klan violence in the Congaree area, there is something to be said about how anti-Black violence could even reach a place like Congaree and really hold a grip on the lives of Black people living in the area.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, let's see the next question. Can you speak on some of the difficulties of commemoration / preservation of sites of history located in swamps, floodplains, former rice plantations, etc.?
Yeah, that's a really, excuse me, that's a really interesting question, because it does get us to thinking deeper about how we remember the past, how we commemorate the past. I mean, certainly with things like cattle mounds, for example, it's not easy to find those in a place like Congaree Swamp. And certainly, as I've said before, a lot of our evidence about what's going on in Congaree over the centuries, again, is based on eyewitness reports, it's based on oral histories, and so forth. It's difficult to really do that kind of commemoration in a place like Congaree Swamp. But I think what this again points to is how there will have to be an even greater effort between Congaree National Park, Lower Richland, the city of Columbia, in Richland County, to do their best to try to find some of these physical markers in Congaree. And if you can't do that, then I think the next best thing to do is, as Congaree National Park is already doing, is trying to use their visitor center to talk about these stories as much as they can. The thing about a place like Congaree, and this also goes for a lot of other environmentally challenging parts of the United States, these places have rich histories that may not always be seen or be apparent in the physical landscape of that time period. But this is why it's important for us to remember that even places like Congaree, that we kind of think of as a wilderness or as a swamp, these are places that have also been touched by human contact and interaction for centuries. And so the commemoration part is very difficult. And this is where we're going to have to get more creative with how we commemorate things, what commemoration means, especially for a place like Congaree, where it's not so easy to find physical representations of the swamp's rich and fascinating past.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. The next question: over the past 50 years, the Black farmer has practically become extinct in Lower Richland. Former farms became pine plantations. How can the incorporation of narratives specific to Black farmers who lived and the select few that thrived, furthermore, African Americans attending and visiting the park?
Yeah, this is something that I think is really worth noting for a handful of reasons. For one, the questioner is absolutely right. The plight of the Black farmer is one of the great unheralded stories of the last 50 to 70 years. If you look at national records of land ownership, specifically by farmers, um, only a very minuscule percentage of farmland in the United States is owned by African Americans, a far lower number than was even the case, say, 30 years ago. This is, I think, one of the topics of the Black-white wealth gap, as we might refer to it, that's not talked about very much. Now, Congaree becomes an important part of the story because, as the questioner points out, thinking about how the plight of Black farmers in Lower Richland is indicative of this larger national story of the loss of Black-owned farmland to white farmers, to larger corporations, and so forth, to the ravages of racism and economic deprivation over the last 60 years. These are all things that you also see in Lower Richland and in the story of Congaree National Park. But I would also say that the stories of the few farmers who remain and those who continue to own their land in Lower Richland, these are the stories we should also highlight for two reasons. Number one, they show the paths that could have been taken from Reconstruction, from the 20th century forward in terms of Black land ownership and Black political and social power. But B, they also point to the fact that these are people we should not ignore in the here and now. I'm a historian. I'm trained to think historically. But I don't want any of us to lose sight of the fact that there are people living in Lower Richland, living in and around Congaree National Park in the here and now, who are still trying to keep the legacy of land ownership alive in their families. And we should make sure we capture those stories as best we can and honor the legacies as best we can. Because for them, this isn't simply history. For them, this is their very livelihoods we're talking about. And these livelihoods are under constant threat for a variety of reasons.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, I'll ask another question here, and then I see Robert Reese has raised his hand, so I will unmute him after I ask this question. If a book of historical fiction were to be written about the Congaree experience, who would be a key real-life protagonist in that story?
Now that's a really interesting question, and I would say one. Well, I think, of course, the Barbers, Harriet Barber, and so forth, would be a one good choice or two good choices. The Maroon Joe I mentioned could be an option, even though we don't really know too much about him. But I would actually argue that Francis Cardozo, who was the Secretary of State for South Carolina in the 1870s, would be an interesting choice, because under his leadership, the Land Commission really entered its golden age, where it had the least amount of quote unquote corruption, where many African Americans were trying to purchase and lease land under his leadership. And I think if you're thinking about the Black story of Congaree, one place to think about it in is with the Land Commission, and particularly the Land Commission under Francis Cardozo in the 1870s. Now, Cardozo himself is a man who should get a historical novel. I mean, he's, again, a Black Secretary of State in Reconstruction era South Carolina. And you add to this the ideas of land ownership, him trying to defend Reconstruction against all of his challengers. And I think you'd have a pretty good historical novel written. Now, if you do write that novel, I at least put me in the acknowledgments. I won't take any of your money. You should earn the full royalties, but at least put me in the acknowledgments somewhere at the beginning of the book. I'd appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Robert, you've been unmuted. Would you like to ask your question?
I welcome the opportunity. Dr. Greene, thank you for the presentation, phenomenal presentation. My family is one of those families that reside in the Lower Richland area. And both my mother and my father families are from this area. My question is, are you familiar with, or do you know if those African Americans or those Blacks or those Maroons that were residing in the Congaree area, did they regularly travel or have communication or contact or intermarry with Blacks that were from the Charleston area, using that riverway as a travel way, and having constant communication back and forth with those Africans that were in the Charleston area? Is that a part of the history of that? Do you know, or were they really sort of did they reside in that local vicinity, not moving, not using that river or those rivers as a transport mechanism back and forth from the coast back to Congaree?
This is an incredibly fascinating question. I'm glad you raised it because, well, for two reasons. Number one, I'll get to the Maroons in a second, but just reminded me that I kind of glossed over the fact that one of the principal groups of people who had a lot of power in Antebellum, South Carolina, in terms of mobility, were enslaved Africans who worked on the waterways, going to and from Charleston into the interior of the state, including through Congaree. Those were enslaved men who were often seen as potentially being very troublesome precisely because they were so mobile, and they could move throughout the state with relative ease. Now, with that said, to answer your question about Maroons intermarrying, the best I can say is that it's hard to say definitively what the fates of many of these Maroons were, because, again, as I mentioned before, the records on them are incredibly scattered. There are some people who didn't really talk much about their lives as Maroons. But with that being said, there were Maroons in Congaree. For example, I mentioned Joe at the start of our presentation this evening. Joe often moved from, as far as we can tell, he moved through Congaree. He moved pretty close to Charleston at various points in his travails as a Maroon. And so we do have some evidence that people like Joe moved throughout parts of the Midlands and Low Country almost at will. Now, keep in mind that as a Maroon, you had to be careful. Some Maroons, as the earlier questioner mentioned with Sylvia Diop's book on Maroon culture, some Maroons did live close to plantations. So some of them may have lived close to the Low Country just for the sake of convenience to get food, clothing, that kind of thing. But the further you move into Congaree, the further you move to the Midlands in the 19th century, the more difficult it becomes to keep up those contacts with folks living in and around Charleston. So to answer your question, I cannot give you a definitive answer on how many Maroons may have intermarried with folks in Charleston, but I will say it was certainly a possibility, because again, you do have that mobility from some Maroons, not all, but some, who moved between the Midlands and Low Country in the 19th century. So it is certainly a possibility.
And can I ask one more question? I don't know if you can still hear me or not.
Oh, sure, I can,
Yeah. I'll take. We'll take after Robert's question. We'll take two more.
Okay, thanks. So I know that there's been an incredible array of historical artifacts and data that show that there was a lot of interaction between Africans and Native Americans long before European settlers came to the Americas. Have you seen any artifacts, or do you know of any of that kind of relationship between Africans and Native Americans prior to European settlers coming to this part of the New World? And the second part is, everybody here, and I'm sure African Americans across the country, will always talk about their Indian roots. And so can you speak a little bit, or do you have any information about if there was a connection between Native Americans and African Americans, particularly those that were settled or those that were using the swamp as a venue or a place for which they can both have reprieve from what would have been a pretty horrific environment in which to live?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second question first, because again, with Congaree Swamp, by the time you have extensive numbers of enslaved Africans in Carolina Colony, in the 18th century in particular, most of them are particularly concentrated along the coastline, in and around Charleston, that area. Now, they do have, of course, interactions with indigenous peoples in and around Congaree. How extensive that interaction is, it's very difficult to say, because we're dealing with groups of people who were often on the move, who did not leave behind the amounts of written records their European counterparts did in South Carolina. But there was certainly interaction there. I mean, I think the most visible interaction is actually the cattle mount I mentioned. That we have some evidence that before enslaved Africans built up that cattle mount, that some of it may have in fact been built by indigenous peoples before that. They just built on top of it. So certainly there's some interaction between those two groups in and around Congaree. But to answer your first question, the thing about talking about the presence of Africans in North America in particular is that it depends on which time period you're talking about. And what I mean is that we are aware of the fact that if you're talking about English colonization of Carolina Colony in 1663 or so, that's one piece of the story. But as I've told my students at Claflin on numerous occasions, the first Africans in what will become South Carolina that we know of were here in the 1520s, thanks to Spanish expeditions in the area. In fact, the first settlement of South Carolina was actually done by the Spanish in 1526. Ironically enough, that particular Spanish colony, which we think was in the area of Georgetown County, that colony was actually destroyed by a slave revolt in the 1520s. Now, again, to your second question about intermingling between Africans and Native Americans, we really don't have a good idea of what happened to those enslaved Africans in 1526 or so, after their slave revolt began and ended and destroyed that Spanish colony in Georgetown County. So some of them may have very well fled into the hinterlands of South Carolina, including Congaree, and just stayed there for the rest of their lives.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. I see. I thought Ebony had her hand up, but I'll go ahead with the next question. Someone asked, are there any remains of the places where people lived in Congaree?
To some extent there are. Some parts of the park do include older homes and houses that very few actual remains are left. In fact, if you're looking at Congaree National Park, the best place to really look for remains and remnants of human life, besides the cattle mounts, are actually the Kingville settlement, which is towards the end of the park itself. Now, I didn't talk about Kingville much because this is more of a story about Southern environmental history overall. But Kingville in the 19th century, which is again just at the edge of the boundaries of Congaree National Park, Kingville was actually one of the most important rail depots in the American South in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Some of it still remains to this day. There's the remains of a hotel there and that kind of thing. But throughout the park, there are some places that still remain that you can, of course, see via tours and that kind of thing. But I think what makes Congaree so interesting is that even if you're taking a tour of the national park, even if you're looking for remains of human settlement, there is always a sense of a deeper history. You are aware of the fact that there were people here, they didn't leave behind much, or what they left behind was conquered once again by the landscape. But there is just enough to whet the appetites of people who are curious to learn more about Congaree. And I think certainly, again, it makes the job of the National Park Service in Congaree so interesting that they on the one hand, they have to work with a landscape that is difficult to traverse, that should be better known throughout the country. But on the other, there are so many stories there that you do see in some of the ruins that are in the landscape, but also there are things like the cattle mounts, which to the untrained eye may not appear to be human remains, but actually are very much created by human beings.
Okay, and then I saw that Ebony Ram had her hand up and Marie has unmuted her. Ebony?
Hi, how are you?
Fine, how are you doing?
Okay, I had to take my headphones off. I'm working technology,
Sure.
figure it out. But
Oh, I
I
understand all
wanted
too
to,
well.
yeah, I wanted to say something because my family has really has passed down stories from my great grandfather Levi Pearson, being a farmer in the Clarendon County area in Manning, South Carolina. I had no idea until I listened to you this morning. I mean, this evening rather, talk about um, farmers in the Congaree area and the Lower Richland area. Is there anywhere I can a book or anything with those stories in it, stories of the different farmers or from I won't say that time period or from that era, from that time that someone has written, like stories of the life of.
You know, that's the thing is that there are some oral histories that can be found online from the 20th century of folks who lived in and around Lower Richland in the Congaree area. Those can be found pretty easily online. They were done through actually Middle Tennessee State University back in 2000s or so. But in terms of an actual book that is just these stories, unfortunately, to my knowledge, there are like smaller books about Lower Richland, for example. There is that series of books on American life that, you know, you see things like they have books on Richland County, books on Black Columbia, that kind of thing. There is a version of that about Lower Richland.
Okay.
But which you can find online or at Barnes and Noble pretty quickly. However, in terms of a work, like a larger work about these families in Lower Richland, to my knowledge, there aren't any other books out there
Okay.
out that specifically, but I think it's a project that definitely should be done if it's not already being done right now. One of the joys of academic work is that you'll say that, oh, this hasn't been written by anybody, and then there's somebody actually working on it right now. But
Okay.
as far as I know, there aren't very many books directly about Lower Richland and these families. There have been oral histories done, interviews done, and some scattered essays about them. But there does, now that you asked this question, there is a need for a book like this, a book about these families, because they do represent a strain of Black history that we tend to downplay, which is rural African Americans. And that sounds kind of weird to say, but you think about African American history, the grand contours of it. It goes from enslavement to Reconstruction, and then bam, you're in the 20th century, the civil rights and Black power movements. And throughout the 20th century, we cannot forget that there are Black men and women still living throughout the rural South and
Yes.
Mississippi Delta, in rural Texas, in parishes of Louisiana, and certainly in Lower Richland, South Carolina as well. So to answer your question, there are like smaller books about Lower Richland that have been produced locally, but in terms of like bigger, grander works about this history in its totality, that is a book that, as far as I know, has not yet been written.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, there are a lot of good questions here, and I would encourage people to use the community features on the Whoville platform. I'd actually started a topic related to Dr. Greene's presentation, and that would be a good place to follow up. And of course, you could send a message to him as well. You could start a meetup if you wanted to talk about some of these topics in depth. And I hate leaving these questions on the table, but I have to set a good example for my future moderators who are going to be on having to work with much tighter time frames. Again, I think this was a wonderful start to the presentation. Very thoughtful questions, thought-provoking answers. I learned a lot. I appreciate how quickly Dr. Greene was able to handle the transition to his smartphone from his laptop. You could tell he's a digital native. And I just didn't, of course we can't applaud, but if you could just acknowledge Dr. Greene in the chat or through a message. This was a really wonderful start to the conference. We'll close the session now, and I hope to see a lot of you at 9 o'clock tomorrow when we start a day-long series of sessions and panels and workshops.